Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming out on this glorious day. Sometimes thinks we need to have these sessions outside. I'm not sure how to So I'm going to try to speak very briefly, but cover a lot of material, so I'm going to talk too fast. Motion to me, because I tend to do that. So how does Islam look at work? Well, there are a number of both Quranic teachings and prophetic sayings, hadith, that address this issue. And to start with, there is an emphasis on the importance of work, as opposed to taking handouts or not working at all. One of them is the saying of the Prophet Muhammad that, by him in whose hand is my soul, meaning God, if one of you were to carry a bundle of firewood on his back and sell it, it would be better for him than begging or asking for something that one will not get a return. So there is a real encouragement for getting out and earning money. And the Prophet himself was a shepherder, he was a trader, he continued to do work even after prophethood. So there's also an attitude, a can-do attitude that no one is too high to go out and earn a living, and there's no need for the person. He also said, never has anyone eaten a better thing than when he eats in his own hands. And that could be applied to both earning a living or potentially growing a garden. You know how good that tastes, right? So there's a satisfaction when you eat from the work of your hands. He also said, when any man does any work or woman, God wishes him to give it perfection and grace. And this is a concept in Islam known as ahsan, which means perfection. So when you do anything, do it your best. Don't do a half. There is also an emphasis in Islam on the lawful earnings. And there are certain categories that are forbidden in the Quran as a source of earning money. Liquor is one of them. Interestingly, here in Oakland, a lot of the liquor stores are owned by Muslims. So there's a real prohibition against that, and some of the prophetic sayings talk about those earnings not having any barakah, any blessing in them. Alcohol, gambling. There's also a prohibition against what is called riba, which is commonly deemed to be an interest or usury, which is basically benefiting from the status of the wealthy versus the status of the poor. And one of the verses in the Quran that talks about it says, God destroys interest and increases charity, which is interesting when you think about some of the painful kind of results that interest has caused very recently in this country. And so there's an emphasis to get charity. There's also an emphasis on investing. And another verse says, oh, you do not eat up interest, double and redouble. So both taking interest and giving interest. So when you're benefiting from interest, it's equally problematic because you're benefiting from the backs of somebody else. And so the other side of it is that there's an encouragement for investment in trade. And we have the example, as I mentioned, of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who was a well-known merchant. Many of his companions, many of the first rulers after him were merchants. And the Middle East actually became a center for trade, both because of its geographical location and because of the many goods that were to be found in India that were taken to Europe, spices, silk, and other products. Another important principle is that both the employer and the employee must have a relationship of honesty. And obviously cheating, deception, any of those things like in interfaith would not be allowed. The employee should not cheat at work by slacking, wasting time. They have computers, whatever people do when they want to waste time. And on the other hand, the employer should not rob the employee of his fair earnings. So that the Quranic verse says, woe to those that deal in fraud, those who when they have to receive by measure from others exact full measure, but when they have to give by measure or rate, give less than they do. So they're very careful about getting paid on time, but when they have to pay other people, they delay. I've worked in a small business, and I know very well how that happens, because you often have a problem with your money flow. And a prophetic saying also that whoever cheats us is not of us, and not the community. And then, of course, there's a whole number of principles related to equitable, just, and fair treatment of employees, because they're the ones who are most likely to be in a situation where they need supported texts. So one of the prophetic sayings that is more about slavery, which pre-existed before Islam, said that they are your brothers whom God has placed in your custody. Let him who has made custodian of his brother, like God, feed him out of what he clothes himself, and impose not on him work that will overcome him. And so this can be applied across the board to any kind of employee, that you treat your employee as you would like to be treated. And in another prophetic saying, the prophet said, it is the duty of the employer to take only such work from the employees which they can do easily. They should not be made to work so that their health is impaired. Of course, that brings to mind the sweatshops, all sorts of different sectors where people are working long hours, doing work that is detrimental to their health. And so taking this into consideration, obviously, we would go against all of those practices. Another similar saying, the worker should not be given a task beyond his physical capabilities, and do not impose upon him more than he can bear. Additionally, justice should be served by fulfilling one's obligation to the employee that is made at the outset of the work. And the Quran says regarding this, only who believe stand firmly for justice, so it's injustice across obviously all sectors, but specifically a prophetic saying that one who exercises his authority and power in an unjust way will not enter into paradise. So there's a special onus upon those who have a relationship of superiority towards another. Regarding the minimum wage, which is a hot issue these days, there are sayings that support the fact that it should meet the basic essentials of the needs and requirements of the worker, so a living wage, and prophetic saying that the prophet himself never paid a low wage to any person. And one of the three people that the prophet Muhammad says he would actually stand against on the day of judgment is a man who engaged a laborer and enjoyed full benefits from him, but did not pay him his due wages. And there's interestingly another well-known prophetic saying that you should pay the laborer his wage before his sweat dries, which you can almost indicate within an hour or within a day, certainly. So the idea of not withholding wages, particularly for people who are working at the bottom of the ladder, because those wages are not very high. And then lastly, there's a real emphasis in Islam about contracts and writing down transactions, and this would be applied as well to the employer-employee contract. Details of the salary, details of the duties of the job should all be stated clearly in the contract. So the Prophet Muhammad said, the employer must declare the wages to the worker before the worker embarks on the required work. And once that contract is signed, both the employer and employee should respect those terms. So it shouldn't be a situation where you keep adding, obligations and you're like, wait a minute, I didn't sign for this. And again, this is reflected in the Quranic verse, or you who believe fulfill your contract. Again, another verse, fulfill your agreement, surely you will be questioned about it. And additionally, the Prophet Muhammad said, a Muslim must abide by their agreement. So these are just a few of scriptural sayings and teachings and principles that certainly are as relevant today as they were 1,400 years ago. And I'm going to stop now and hear from my colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter will be Melissa Prager, who works at San Francisco's Jewish Vocational Service, which is a leader in workforce development. She's a workshop facilitator helping the unemployed and the underemployed gain jobs or skills. Welcome, Melissa.
Shabbat Shalom. I'm so excited to present here because I have a background as an environmental activist working with nonprofit organizations, but I identify as a person of faith, a religious person, as a person who has an academic background in religion as well, and there's often not room for the religious person, I feel like, in the environmental movement. So today in this conference, I feel like I have that permission, so thank you so much. Last night when I was talking to Annie Leonard before her amazingly powerful presentation, I asked her about how she prepares for different presentations, specifically specifically in the context of her background as environmental activist in this religious context. And she said that it's really about the distilling of information and the importance of the distilling, as she mentioned yesterday. And she said, of course, the shorter the presentation, then the more you have to get distillation. And so, with that, I will do my best to distill thousands of years of Jewish thought and text around the role of work and labor. So I think we can't talk about work and divine purpose in the Jewish context without talking about the concept that I'm sure that many of you are aware of tikkun olam, which translates as repairing the world. It's not unique to Judaism, of course. Every tradition has some version of bettering the world or repairing the world. But even though we use this phrase so often, we have lost the story of what the origins are. The origins are in our cosmology, in our creation story. So when we're also talking about the interconnectedness of our speeches here over the course of the conference, it's so fascinating to me that in our reflections of the ideas of work that we're drawing on our cosmologies. So I will too. And the mystics teach us in the Jewish tradition that before the universe was created, there was enough space for all of the divine life. Right? And so in order for there to be creation, in order for the divine to create the universe, he had to create space and contract. So if we think of ourselves as being created in the divine image, what does that mean for us when we're creating space? And in that process of creation, as God birthed the world through a contraction, then this divinity was through these vessels of holy light, just as I was trying to speak to you in this process of creation, that even through words, these are the vessels that are limited. And those vessels couldn't retain the power of his light, and so they shattered. So the shattering of these vessels meant the shattering of divine light throughout the world. And so our purpose in life is to find those sparks. So finding those sparks, whether it's in our conversation, in good deeds, in the work that we do in the world, so that we can repair the world or restore the world. So that's the cosmology story here that's so lost. So now we use the word tikkun olam to mean social action, to mean anything that's bettering the world, but so few Jews even know that that's stemmed in this mystical idea of creation. So what that looks like now in many nonprofit organizations, such as the one that I'm representing now, Jewish Vocational Service, is that we're repairing the world by helping people transform their lives through self-sufficiency. A lot of the conversation that we have on this conference is around the overworked, how overworked we are. And whether what you say in the last 30 years, we've added an entire month to the year of our workload. That's pretty amazing. But in a Jewish vocational service, the clients who we have are the unemployed and the underemployed. And so it's a very different story. So in some ways, the conversation we're having has a class bias, the assumption that people are working. And so in the clients who we're working with, and I personally am working with on a regular basis, these unemployed and underemployed, the narrative that they have, what we're finding, the biggest barrier actually to unemployment for many of them is a story, is a narrative that they are unemployable, that they are too old, too young, don't have the technology skills, aren't keeping up, mothers who are re-insured, who's going to want to hire them? That those narratives, those are the barriers actually that we're really dealing with. We are dealing with a profound crisis, as we know, of inequality here in the Bay Area, where 1.3 million people are living below the self-sufficiency rate. So we're helping people in that way by helping them build skills so that they become employable at JVS. And so the second point I want to make is this idea of the word itself, work. In Hebrew is avodah. So in the Jewish text of Pirkei, the ethics of our fathers, there's a teaching that says that the world stands on three things: Torah, acts of loving kindness, and this word avodah. Well, avodah actually it means work and worship. So this same word that means work means worship. What does that mean? I'd love for us to have a conversation about that, right? I don't know. Does it mean that labor itself can be a form of worship? Does it mean that our divine purpose in life is itself to worship God? Is that our work? What does it mean? There's a lot that we can say about that. I think what's interesting is next week is Passover. And Passover, and the Jewish holiday of Passover, we use this word avodah so much in the text, in the story of our liberation. Actually, just to go even further to illustrate the power of this word, we talk about the story of us being avodim, of us being slaves. So the same word actually refers to the word to be slaves, so we can be that extreme. But we release ourselves from slavery, from avodim, so that we can la'avot, so that we can worship. So the same word from slavery goes to worship. So work is so important, we can't limit to work, right? In Jewish tradition, work is important unless, and this is my third and final point, unless it interferes with Shabbat. So not that we should rest on the Sabbath in order to rejuvenate ourselves so that we can work again, but actually Shabbat is elevated. And as Erica said so beautifully this morning, that Shabbat is actually a place for us to sit back and look at what have we created. What if we stopped creating? What does that really mean? Not just not working. Actually, for the religious, that means I'm not going to cut my hair. I'm not going to change anything from the way it is right now. In the week, during the work week, that's the week of space. That's the time of space. We're in space, right? We are in the world of creating and creation. And on Shabbat, it's a time. It's this place of time and sacredness and going back to the creation of the world. So with that, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Melissa. Our third presenter, this is different from what you have in the program, is Kundan Singh, who is a faculty at Sophia University, as well as the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he will speak to us from the Human Tradition. Welcome.
I'm filling in for Dr. Rita Sharma, and I'm going to present Hindu perspective on work. Now, given that this tradition is very diverse, and given that there is a unity behind that diversity is also, I will just focus on one tradition, the tradition which comes from the Bhagavad Gita, which emphasizes on Karma Yoga, or basically finding one's union with the divine using work. So that is going to be my focus. But before that, let me just speak a little bit about Hindu cosmology. Now, the essential aspect of Hindu cosmology is that there is oneness. There is just one within this universe. This one has become everything. It has manifested itself in multiplicity. In its transcendental aspect, it is the divine. In the cosmic aspect, it's gods and goddesses. And on the terrestrial aspect, it is human beings and so many things, animate and inanimate. So there is nothing in this universe which is not that one entity which has become everything. In the transcendental aspect, this divine has two aspects, the static aspect and the dynamic aspect. The static aspect essentially is that witness consciousness, which is looking out for everything, which is just in the witness mode, taking care of all the activities, or supervising all the activities which are happening in this universe. And then there is this dynamic aspect. The dynamic aspect is basically executing everything which is happening in this universe. And the static and dynamic are basically working in tandem for taking care of all the activities within the world. So when you emphasize on the witness consciousness, then you have traditions which basically speak about finding a liberation in that witness consciousness, which means that through the process of your spiritual evolution, you will find a state which will give you the consciousness which is witnessing everything in this universe. On the other hand, when you focus on the dynamic aspect of the divine, then you become that executive force which is taking care of all the activities. So there are two different aspects to divinity. The aspect which emphasizes on liberation basically finds its culmination in moksha. The Bhagavad Gita is basically finding that liberation or moksha through work. So what Bhagavad Gita says is that in normal human activity, when we work, we are impelled by desire. It is basically desire which makes us work, which makes us apply ourselves to the work. But as long as the desire is there, then liberation is not possible, or moksha is not possible. So in order to become liberated, or in order to find moksha, one has to become desireless. Now, desireless work does not happen right away. It is a process. Usually, we start work by having a desire, by identifying ourselves with it. So the next stage is that whatever you work, or whatever work you engage in, you just offer it to the divine. And as you continually offer it to the divine, you will reach a state where you will be able to engage in desireless activity in dictates or according to the dictates with the divine. Then basically your will and the will of the divine will become one. You will attain that witness consciousness. You will be engaging in the upkeep of the world, but you will not be attached. It will be an action which will be detached, or it will be an action which will be involved, but at the same time, it will be non-involved as well. So you will be engaging in activities that are inspired by non-involved involvement. It is almost as if you are there and at the same time you are not there. This is the ultimate that the Gita talks about as far as work is concerned. Now I was finding a couple of similarities with the Jewish tradition as I was hearing you speak. Now one of the concepts that the Gita talks about is lok sangra, which means working to keep the world together. The world has become fragmented. The world has become fragmented because that one divinity is manifesting in multiplicity and plurality of it. And if we do not emphasize on that oneness, what we'll have is fragmentation and dismemberment. But we have to engage in work which has to bring the world together. So the idea of lok sangra is very important. And then it also talks about karma yoga. It is then that work actually becomes worship. Because whatever you are engaging in terms of your work, you are actually offering it to the divine. And as you are offering it to the divine, through that process it gets sanctified. So in this process of sanctification, what happens is that you ultimately reach your liberation in the divinity. There are other traditions also which do not emphasize on liberation. These traditions actually talk about a very dynamic involvement with the world, but I think I will bring that up probably in conversation, maybe in future conversations. I'll need to take some more time.